You think $75,000 a year sounds like solid money, right? Enough to live comfortably, maybe save a little, take a vacation without stress. But here's what nobody tells you until you're already living it. That number on your offer letter, it's basically a fiction. The lifestyle you can actually afford has almost nothing to do with that salary figure, and the gap between what you think you're making and what actually hits your bank account every month is where financial dreams go to wither and fade away. My name is Alex, and I've spent way too much time analyzing the brutal math of American salaries. If you're trying to figure out whether your income is actually enough to build the life you want, hit that subscribe button because what I'm about to show you is going to completely reframe how you think about money. And make sure to give this video a thumbs up if you're tired of feeling broke on what's supposed to be a good salary. Here's the core truth that changes everything. The difference between a $75,000 salary and a $100,000 salary isn't $25,000. Not even close. And the gap between 100,000 and 150,000, it's not what you think either. Because taxes, insurance, and retirement contributions don't scale in a nice, neat, linear way. They're designed to punish you in ways that are going to surprise you. Most people look at salary comparisons and do simple subtraction in their heads. They think, okay, if I make 25,000 more per year, that's about 2,000 extra per month. Wrong on every level. That's not how any of this actually works. And the reason why is going to make you question everything you thought you knew about climbing the income ladder. But before I show you the real numbers, you need to understand something about the system itself that most financial advisors won't tell you. Let's start with what everyone gets wrong. You see that $75,000 salary? Most people think that means they're making about $6,250 per month. They start planning their entire financial life around that number. They look at apartments, they calculate car payments, they budget for groceries and entertainment, and then the first paycheck arrives and reality hits like a freight train. Because the government gets their cut first. Federal income tax comes off the top. State income tax follows right behind, unless you're lucky enough to live in one of the 7 states without it. Then Social Security takes its 6.2% bite. Medicare grabs another 1.45%. And we haven't even talked about health insurance premiums yet, which for a decent plan through your employer might run you anywhere from $200 to $500 per month, depending on whether you're covering just yourself or a family. Oh, and if you're being remotely smart about your financial future, you're putting something into your 401k. Let's say you're doing the bare minimum to get your employer match, maybe 5% of your salary. That's another chunk gone before you ever see it. Here's where it gets interesting. And stay with me because this is where the real story emerges. Let's run the actual numbers for someone making $75,000 in a state with moderate income tax, let's say 5%. Federal tax is going to run roughly $10,000 after the standard deduction. State tax is about $3,000. FICA taxes, that's your Social Security and Medicare combined, that's another $5,700. Health insurance premium, let's call it $4,000 for the year for a single person with decent coverage. 401k contribution at 5% is $3,750. Add all that up and you're losing about $27,000 before you see a single penny. Your $75,000 salary just became $48,000 in actual take-home money. That's $4,000 per month, not $6,250. $4,000. You just lost over $2,000 per month to things you can't avoid. Now let's look at the $100,000 salary, because this is where people think the magic happens. This is the dream number for a lot of folks. 6 figures, it sounds substantial. It sounds like you've made it. But here's the problem. When you earn more, you don't just pay more taxes, you pay a higher percentage in taxes because of how tax brackets work. Federal tax on 100,000 jumps to about 15,000. State tax at 5% is now 5,000. FICA is 7,600, though Social Security caps out so it doesn't scale forever. Health insurance is roughly the same, maybe 4,000. But now your 401k contribution at 5% is 5,000. We're at about 36,000 in total deductions. Your take home from a $100,000 salary is 64,000. That's about 5,300 per month. Wait, let me make sure you caught that. You went from 75,000 to 100,000 in gross salary. That's a $25,000 raise on paper. But your actual monthly take home only went up by $1,300. You gained $25,000 in salary, but only about $15,000 in actual money you can spend. The system ate $10,000 of your raise before you ever touched it, and that's exactly why so many people who get promoted or switch jobs for more money end up feeling like nothing really changed. They're still struggling. They're still living paycheck to paycheck because they budgeted based on the wrong number. Now let's look at the $150,000 salary. This is where people assume life gets easy. This is wealth territory in most people's minds. Let's run it. Federal tax jumps significantly because now you're solidly in the 24% bracket for a good chunk of your income. You're looking at about $26,000 in federal tax. State tax at 5% is $7,500. FICA is about $9,500, still capped on Social Security. Health insurance, same $4,000. 401k at 5% is now $7,500. Total deductions, about $53,000. Your take home is $97,000, or about $8,100 per month. So you went from $100,000 gross to $150,000 gross. That's a $50,000 increase on paper. But your monthly take home only went up by about $2,800. You're taking home $35,000 more per year, not $50,000. $15,000 evaporated. Let that sink in for a second. The gap between your salary and your actual life gets wider the more you earn. Not proportionally smaller, wider, because the percentage taken from you increases as you climb. But here's where the psychology gets really twisted, and this is what traps most people. They get the raise. They see the new salary number on their offer letter. Their brain does the math wrong, and they immediately lifestyle inflate based on the gross number, not the net. They move to a more expensive apartment, they finance a nicer car, they start eating out more because they quote unquote can afford it now. And then 6 months later, they're more broke than they were before the raise because they overestimated their spending power by thousands of dollars per month. This is the part where most people check out. Don't be most people, because what I'm about to show you next is the thing that actually determines whether your salary gives you a comfortable life or a constant financial panic attack, and it has everything to do with the single biggest expense in your budget: housing. This is where your entire financial picture either works or completely falls apart. Because the old advice, the 28% rule, the idea that you shouldn't spend more than 28% of your gross income on housing, it's based on a version of America that doesn't exist anymore. That rule was created when housing was cheaper, when healthcare didn't cost a fortune, when student loans weren't bleeding people dry. It's obsolete advice in a modern nightmare. Let's apply the 28% rule to our three salaries and see what happens. 75,000 gross means you should spend no more than about $1,750 per month on housing. 100,000 gross means 2,300. 150,000 means 3,500. Sounds reasonable, right? But remember, we're not working with gross income, we're working with take home. So let's recalculate based on reality. If you're taking home $4,000 per month at $75,000, spending $1,750 on housing means you're burning through 43% of your actual money, not 28%, 43%. That leaves you with about $2,200 for literally everything else: food, transportation, insurance that isn't health, utilities, phone bill, internet, clothing, any form of entertainment, and hopefully saving something. You're not comfortable at $75,000 following the 28% rule. You're surviving, barely. At $100,000, taking home $5,300 and spending $2,300 on housing, you're at 43% again. You've got 3,000 left. Better, definitely better. You've got breathing room now. You can save. You can handle an emergency without your life imploding, but you're not living large, you're living carefully. At 150,000, taking home 8,100 and spending 3,500 on housing, you're finally down to 43%. You have 4,600 remaining. Now we're talking. Now you've got actual discretionary money. Now you can make financial decisions that aren't based purely on fear. But here's the thing that makes all of this so much worse. That 28% rule assumes you can actually find housing at that price point in the city where you work. And in most major metropolitan areas in 2025, absolutely not. Not even close. If you're in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, Boston, you're laughing at the idea of spending $1,750 on rent with a $75,000 salary. A one-bedroom apartment in those cities runs you $2,500 to $4,000 easily, which means if you're making $75,000 and trying to live in a high cost of living city, you're spending 60 to 100% of your take-home just on rent. You're basically paying for the privilege of being broke in an expensive location. Even in medium cost of living cities, places like Denver, Austin, Portland, Nashville, that 1,750 is going to get you maybe a studio or a one bedroom in a neighborhood you're not thrilled about. You're compromising on space, location, or safety just to make the math work. This is why geography might be the single most important financial decision you ever make, and there's a specific calculation you need to run before you accept any job offer that I'm going to walk you through in just a moment. Here's the thing about transportation costs that nobody seems to want to talk about. It's not the second biggest expense after housing. For a lot of people, especially in car-dependent cities, it's actually bigger than housing when you add up all the real costs. Not just the car payment, not just the insurance, all of it. The gas, the maintenance, the registration, the parking, the depreciation, the repairs, the inevitable moment when your transmission decides to retire early and takes $3,000 of your emergency fund with it. Transportation is a wealth destroyer disguised as a necessity, and the financial impact scales in ways that will surprise you. Let's start with that $75,000 salary. You're taking home $4,400 a month. You're already spending $2,600 on housing, leaving you $1,800 for everything else. Now you need to get to work. If you're in a city with decent public transit, congratulations, you're spending maybe $70 to $150 a month on a transit pass. That's manageable. That leaves you $1,650 to $1,730 for everything else in your life. But if you're in one of the 90+% of American cities where you absolutely need a car, welcome to a completely different financial reality. The average car payment in 2025 is just over $600 a month. Insurance adds another $150 to $200, and that's if you're over 25 with a clean driving record. Gas is another $150 to $200 depending on your commute. Maintenance, if you're being responsible and actually doing oil changes and rotating tires and not ignoring that check engine light, is another $100 a month when you average it out. You're at $1,000 to $1,100 a month minimum. From that original $1,800 left after housing, you now have $700 to $800 remaining for groceries, utilities, phone, internet, clothing, medical expenses, student loans, and trying to have any kind of life whatsoever. But here's where it gets worse. Most people making $75,000 aren't driving paid-off reliable used cars. They're financing something newer because they convince themselves they need reliability, which is just code for wanting something that doesn't embarrass them in the work parking lot. That $600 payment is often on a $35,000 to $40,000 vehicle they absolutely cannot afford. They're in automotive servitude, working to pay for the thing that gets them to work, which is possibly the most perfect example of a financial doom loop ever created. Now let's move up to $100,000. You're taking home $5,700 monthly. $2,600 on housing leaves you $3,100. If you're smart enough to keep that same $1,000 a month transportation budget, you now have $2,100 for everything else. That's survivable. That's actually workable. But what usually happens instead? Lifestyle creep hits transportation harder than almost any other category. That raises an important question. Why would someone making 30% more suddenly think they need a $50,000 vehicle instead of a $35,000 one? Because car marketing is psychological warfare and it works. You start thinking you've earned an upgrade, you deserve it, you've worked hard, you need something that reflects your success, which is hilarious because going from a $450 payment to a $750 payment doesn't reflect success. It reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how money works. But let's say you fall into this trap. $750 for the car, $200 for insurance on the more expensive vehicle, $200 for gas, $100 for maintenance. You're at $1,250 a month. From that original $3,100 after housing, you're down to $1,850. You increased your income by $25,000 a year, and your leftover money after housing and transportation only went up by about $1,000 a month because you made one spectacularly unwise decision about what to drive. At $150,000, taking home $8,100 and spending $3,500 on housing, you have $4,600 left. Here's where the math finally starts working in your favor, but only if you don't do something completely ridiculous. If you maintain that same $1,000 to $1,200 transportation budget, you now have $3,400 to $3,500 for everything else. You have actual breathing room, you can save aggressively, you can invest, you can build wealth. But what happens instead? For a lot of high earners, this is when they convince themselves they need the luxury vehicle. The $70,000 SUV with the premium package, the $950 monthly payment that becomes $1,100 with the full coverage insurance. Maybe a second vehicle for the household, because why coordinate schedules when you can just double your automotive expenses? Now you're at $2,000 a month or more for transportation, and that $4,600 cushion just became $2,600. You still feel comfortable because $2,600 is more than what someone making $75,000 has after housing and transportation. So you're technically ahead, but you just spent an extra $10,000 to $12,000 a year to feel ahead instead of actually getting ahead. You bought the feeling of wealth instead of building actual wealth. And that psychological swap is why so many high earners are still financially fragile. Here's the framework you actually need. Your total transportation costs, everything, all in, should never exceed 10% of your gross income. Not your car payment, not your car payment plus insurance, everything. At $75,000, that's $625 a month maximum. At $100,000, $833. At $150,000, $1,250. These numbers assume you're also saving appropriately and not drowning in other expenses. And yes, these targets are hard to hit if you're financing a new car. That's the point. The entire car financing industry is designed to get you to ignore total cost of ownership and focus only on whether you can technically afford the monthly payment, which is completely backward. Let me show you what happens when you actually follow this 10% rule versus what most people do. If you're making $100,000 and keeping transportation at $800 a month instead of $1,200, that's $400 extra dollars monthly, $4,800 a year. Over 10 years, invested at a conservative 7% average return, that's about $66,000. That's the real cost of your car decision, not the difference in vehicle price, the difference in wealth accumulation over time. And most people never run this calculation because it's too painful to see what that premium vehicle actually costs in opportunity. Now, let's talk about what changes when you have that extra money left over after housing and transportation, the discretionary spending gap. This is where life actually feels different at different income levels, and the numbers are more dramatic than you think. At $75,000 after housing and transportation, If you're managing both reasonably, you might have 1500 left for everything else. Groceries are 400 to 500, utilities are another 150, phone is 70, internet is 60, basic medical copays and prescriptions another 100. You're down to 600 before you've done anything remotely fun or handled any surprise expense. Dining out is maybe twice a month if you're careful. Entertainment is mostly free or cheap. Travel is a weekend road trip once or twice a year if you save up. That gym membership, you're thinking hard about whether you really need it or if you can just work out at home. Streaming services get rotated based on what shows you want to watch that month because paying for three simultaneously feels irresponsible. At 100,000, after managing housing and transportation properly, you have maybe 2,500 for everything else. Same fixed costs, 400 for groceries, utilities, phone, internet, medical. Now you have about 1,000 truly discretionary. Dining out becomes weekly instead of monthly. You can take a real vacation once a year without financing it. You can have the gym membership and not feel guilty. You can maintain multiple streaming services simultaneously without playing subscription Tetris. You can handle minor emergencies without financial panic. You can buy clothes when you need them instead of when the old ones literally fall apart. This is the income level where life stops feeling like constant financial stress and starts feeling manageable, not luxurious, not wealthy, manageable. At 150,000, after housing and transportation, you might have 3,500 left. After fixed expenses, you have around 2,000 truly discretionary every month. This is where life actually feels comfortable. Dining out whenever you want without checking your account first. Multiple vacations a year, hobbies that cost money. You can take that pottery class or join that climbing gym or buy that camera equipment without having a financial crisis. You can go to a concert without it being a major budget event you plan for months in advance. This is the level where you stop making every single decision based on cost and start making some decisions based on what you actually want to do. But here's what most people miss. That discretionary gap isn't just about fun. It's about building wealth and creating a financial cushion that changes your entire relationship with money and risk. At 75,000, trying to build a 6-month emergency fund of $13,000 when you have maybe 300 a month to save takes 3.5 years if nothing goes wrong, which it will. Your car will need new tires. Your laptop will expire. You'll have a medical expense. So realistically, you're looking at 5 years or more to build a basic emergency fund. 5 years of being one unexpected expense away from financial chaos. Beyond the employer match on your 401k, forget it. You're probably not doing it. Any additional retirement saving beyond the match requires money you simply don't have unless you're living extremely lean or have no other debt. Paying off student loans ahead of schedule? Not happening. You're making minimum payments and hoping for the best. Investing in a taxable brokerage account? That's a luxury for other people. You're in survival mode, pretending to be stability mode. At 100,000, building that same emergency fund with 700 a month to save takes about 18 months. Still a long time, but achievable in a reasonable time frame. You can contribute beyond the employer match. Maybe an extra 5% of your salary into retirement accounts, $3,500 a year. Over 30 years, that becomes $500,000. You can make extra payments on student loans and actually see the principal dropping. You can start investing outside of retirement accounts. You're not building wealth fast, but you're building it. You're making progress. You can see the path to financial security even if you're not there yet. At 150,000, that emergency fund gets built in under a year if you prioritize it. You can max out your 401k and an IRA simultaneously. That's about 23,000 a year in tax advantage space, which over 30 years becomes several $1,000,000. You can pay off student loans aggressively. You can invest heavily in taxable accounts. You can save for a house down payment without it taking a decade. This is the income level where you're not just surviving or slowly building wealth. You're actively constructing financial independence at a pace that will actually matter in your lifetime. Your future millionaire self isn't a fantasy, it's a mathematical inevitability if you don't sabotage it with unwise spending decisions. And that's the brutal truth about these income levels. The difference between 75 and 150,000 isn't just about having nicer things. It's about having options. It's about being able to make decisions based on what's best for your life instead of what you can barely afford. It's about building a foundation that turns into generational wealth instead of just surviving until the next paycheck. The gap isn't just financial, it's psychological, emotional, and entirely life altering. And if you're on the lower end of that spectrum right now, understanding these numbers isn't depressing, it's clarifying. Because now you know exactly what changes when your income grows, and more importantly, you know what not to do with that extra money when it finally arrives.